In March of 1951, a large part of the country sat down to meet the man newspapers called the Prime Minister of the underworld. They were not allowed to look at his face. They got his hands. That was the deal. Frank Costello would sit in a New York hearing room in front of a Senate committee, and the live television cameras would stay on the table, on the fingers, on the way a man who did not want to be famous kept twisting one palm against the other while the questions kept coming. It sounds like a small vanity. It was not. In 1951, roughly half of American households had a television. The Kefauver hearings were not a late-night curiosity. They were daytime. They were in living rooms and barrooms and cafeterias. In New York, several stations carried the proceedings live. Broadway noticed the empty seats. People held gatherings just to watch. Later estimates put the audience for Costello's appearance in the tens of millions. You do not need a precise Nielsen number to understand the point. For a few days, the most powerful gangster most Americans had never seen became a pair of hands on a wooden table. The objection was simple. Do not put his face on the live cameras. The committee had a long official name: the Special Committee to Investigate Organized Crime in Interstate Commerce. People called it the Kefauver Committee after Estes Kefauver, a senator from Tennessee who understood cameras better than most of the men he subpoenaed. The work had already moved through other cities: Miami, St. Louis, Kansas City. Gamblers, sheriffs, local machines. In one hearing, a betting man tried to treat television itself as the insult and walked his protest around the room. Kefauver's answer was that a public hearing stays public. By March of 1951, the circus had come to New York, and New York had Frank Costello. Costello was not the barber chair kind of legend. He was the man who made gambling look like a utility and politics look like a conversation. Treasury men had given him that Prime Minister nickname. He preferred not to be photographed. Publicity, for him, was not romance. It was a leak in the plumbing. So when he walked into federal court on March 13, 1951, to be sworn, the problem was not only the senators, it was the lenses. His lawyer, George Wolfe, objected to having his client's face televised. The committee wanted a public hearing. Costello wanted a private consultation with counsel and a face that did not belong to the nation. The compromise was almost elegant in its cruelty. Live television would not show his head. It would show his hands. This is a public hearing. It stays public. Here is the joke history does not always print in the same paragraph. Newsreel cameras still took the whole man. Evening broadcasts could still give the country a face. The live image, the one that made housewives stop and bartenders turn up the set, was the hands. Costello won a kind of privacy and lost a kind of control. Hands do not have a poker face. They rub, they lock, they give away the minutes. Chief Counsel Rudolph Halley and the senators asked the questions men in that room always asked. Money, associates, gambling, influence. Costello's answers, as people who watched later described them, were often low, incomplete, or missing. He mumbled, he stalled, he declined. A man who had spent years staying out of photographs was now being asked to perform under lights he could not escape by stepping sideways. On March 15th, he decided he had had enough. Am I under arrest? He asked in the room whether he was under arrest. He stood. He did not complete a clean exit at once. There was a scramble of procedure. Wolfe produced the medical note. Acute laryngotrachetes, an inflammation of the voice box and windpipe, rest recommended. The committee was not impressed. Costello was under subpoena. Leaving was not a lifestyle choice. Kefauver made it clear that contempt was on the table. The doctor says he needs rest. He is under subpoena. He left anyway, in the sense that mattered. He stopped answering. The Senate later cited him. In 1952, he was sentenced to 18 months and a fine. He served about 14 months and walked out of a Michigan federal prison in October of 1953. The Prime Minister had been made to sit in a different kind of room. Stay with the hands a little longer, because that is the part that still works on a screen. The questions did not get prettier. Whose money, whose friends? A face can be arranged. Costello had arranged his for decades. The clothes, the calm, the sense that he was a businessman who happened to know people. Hands under a hard light are harder to costume. Viewers who never learned the structure of a crime family learned something simpler. The man was uncomfortable. The man did not want to be there. The man who was supposed to be untouchable was being touched by a procedure he could not buy off in an afternoon. That is not the same thing as a conviction for running the country. The Kefauver Committee did not dismantle the organization in a week. Committees do not. What they did was move the underworld from rumor to furniture. It was in the house. It had knuckles. Other witnesses filled the New York days. Virginia Hill, Joe Adonis, Frank Erickson, even a former mayor, William O'Dwyer, dragged into the same weather. Willie Morty, who had been close to Costello, talked more than was wise. He was dead before the year was out. I am not going to turn that into a second movie. It is a fact that belongs in the margin. Publicity was not only embarrassing. In that world, it could be fatal. Costello survived the hearings in the narrow sense. He did not survive them in the sense he cared about. After March of 1951, he was no longer a rumor with good tailoring. He was a television event. Tax cases followed in the years after. So did the slow loss of the quiet that had been his real luxury. Kefauver, for his part, became a kind of American product. The hearings had ratings. Ratings make senators into household objects. Whether that was civic virtue or show business is a fair argument. Both can be true at once. A public investigation that nobody watches is a file. A public investigation that empties theaters is a fact about the country. People like to say television created the modern gangster. That is lazy. The men were already there. Television created the modern audience for the gangster, sitting on a sofa, deciding whether those hands looked guilty. Let me be precise about what the cameras were allowed to do, because the myth has gotten sloppy. Costello did not invent the idea of hiding. He asked not to be a face on a live feed. The committee agreed to a limited live picture. That agreement did not bind every camera in the building. If you think he outsmarted the 20th century with one objection, you are giving him too much and the newsreels too little. He outsmarted the close-up for a few hours. The country still got the story. The country still got the contempt citation. The country still got the nickname attached to a pair of restless palms. Why did it work as drama? Because the alternative was a still photograph of a well-dressed man looking sideways, which Americans had already seen in newspapers. Hands were new. Hands suggested work. Hands suggested nerves. Hands suggested that power, when forced to sit still, has nowhere to put itself. The questions underneath were older: interstate gambling, wire rooms, political friendships. The committee's theory was not that crime was a local hobby. It was that money moved across state lines and that the federal government had a reason to look. Costello was useful because he sat at the place where the hobby looked like a company. He did not, in that room, give them a tidy chart of families and territories. He gave them refusal, illness, and a walkout. Refusal reads, on television, like a confession even when it is legally something else. That is the danger of a public hearing and also the point of one. I want to keep Joseph Barbara's farmhouse out of this except as a shadow. Appalachian was 6 years later. Different day, different tool, a state trooper and a pad of plate numbers. In 1951, the tool was a camera and a senator who knew what a camera did. Same appetite in the country, show us the system, different door. If you came here for a shootout, this is the wrong hour. Nobody fires a gun in this story that I am going to stage for you. The violence, if you need it, is off-screen and later. The thing on screen is a man trying not to be seen and becoming unforgettable because of it. That is a better lesson about power than a throne. Costello wanted the old arrangement: influence without a close-up, friendship without a transcript. A city that understood him without putting him in the living room between the soap and the baseball. The committee wanted the opposite, names on a record, lights. A public that would stop treating the underworld as colorful fiction. Neither side got a clean win. The organization continued. Costello's particular quiet did not. Viewers got a spectacle that they could describe the next morning without knowing a single structure chart. Hands, a walkout, a doctor's note about a throat. Acute laryngotrachitis is not a phrase that sings. That is why it is useful. It is medical. It is specific. It is the kind of excuse a serious man produces when he wants to leave a room without calling it fear. The committee heard it as contempt. A lot of the country heard it as theater. Both hearings happened at once. After he went to prison on the contempt sentence, the story should have gotten smaller. Prison is supposed to shrink a reputation. It did not work that way. The Prime Minister had been processed. Processing is a kind of fame. When he came out in 1953, reporters were still there. He tried to lose them. That too is a kind of confession. The cameras had followed him home. The tax case in the mid-1950s is another file. I am not going to try it here. Contempt was the souvenir of the hearing room. Tax was the government's longer tool. Together they meant the quiet decade Costello had wanted was over. I am not going to pretend this hearing saved America from gambling or from men like him. I am going to say something narrower. For a few days, in March of 1951, the hidden country was forced to sit with its hands on the table. You can hide a face. You cannot always hide what the face is doing when it thinks nobody is allowed to look. Remember the date the way you remember a plate number. March 1951, New York, a Senate room. A compromise that was supposed to protect a man and instead made him into the only image people kept. Not the smile, the hands,